Welcome to the National Pharmaceutical Congress End of Summer Webinar 2025, Cross-Border Shockwaves. Like Canada's counterparts worldwide, the Canadian pharmaceutical industry is bracing for the impact of U.S. health reforms. With tariffs and drug pricing still uncertain, two questions loom large. How hard will the shockwave hit? And can Canada withstand the blow? Pricing, OPEX, drug services and supply chains. What Canada exports versus imports, and where will the work ultimately end up? What to do, what to avoid. Where is Canada vulnerable, and where are the positive policy shifts? In all this, one thing holds true. Whether the cross-border shockwaves are minor or seismic, Canada must be prepared to absorb the impact. I am Ben Perry of Pangea Consultants, and together with my co-host, the one and only Mitch Shannon of Chronicle Companies, and an all-star faculty supporting the panel today. The National Pharmaceutical Congress examines how these recent health policy shifts could reshape Canadian healthcare industry. And speaking of reshaping, it is some of the finest companies reshaping Canadian healthcare that are also sponsoring today's webinar. A special note of thanks. We value your support in bringing this webinar to the audience today. It is now time that we bring Mitch Shannon to the table to introduce our esteemed panel and steer us through this uncharted territory. Did you bring your paddle, Mitch?
Thank you for that kind introduction, Ben. I think I see what you were doing there. If you were trying to provoke me into a discussion about paddles and headmasters and schoolboys in disgrace, I will not take that bait. Welcome everyone to an important discussion, one we never expected to have, one that would have been unimaginable as recently as 1 year ago. As Ben correctly said, we in the life sciences are entering uncharted territory. Fortunately, we have four expert trail masters to guide us through this. Several of them are familiar to delegates and they're good friends of the NPC. Start with Eileen McMahon. She's a partner at Torrey's LLP and the firm's life sciences guru. Torrey's, of course, is a binational law firm with offices in Toronto and New York City. So she's clearly qualified to talk us through the legal ramifications of these shockwaves. Welcome Dr. Mike Exton, CEO of Lexicon Pharmaceuticals in New Jersey. Truly a man of the world, having worked in Europe, Taiwan, and his native Australia during a long career at Novartis. Leads me to Brian Bloom, the co-founder, CEO, and chairman of Bloom Burton, the preeminent life sciences investment firm in Canada. Brian is known as a skilled rainmaker. So Eileen, Mike, and Brian are with us this morning. They will answer your questions in real time. What you need to do is type them into the box on the bottom of your screen, and we will take it from there. But to set the stage this morning, we have Professor Ted Witek of the University of Toronto School of Public Health, who is going to offer the opening remarks. Some of you will know Ted as the former CEO of Boehringer Ingelheim in Canada. Ted has certainly earned the title of International Man of Mystery. To underline that, his comments are pre-recorded this morning because right now he's getting off a plane at Heathrow as we speak. We will hear from Ted in about 1 minute. First this morning, we have a few icebreaker questions, multiple choice questions for you delegates to get things started. So get ready to answer these questions. First up on your screens right now, which of the following developments do you think will have the greatest impact on Canada's pharmaceutical sector? Go ahead and vote. They are U.S. Drug pricing reforms, NIH upheavals, FDA reforms, HHS Secretary, our Mr. Kennedy, issuing disinformation, and anything else. If you have any others, just put them in the chat box. Go ahead and vote, please. Votes are coming in. Maybe another 5 seconds, Christella. Okay, I think we have a consensus. So drug pricing reforms, more than half of you think this is the single most disruptive factor. Kennedy is down at 19%. I personally would have ranked him higher, but I guess that's why we're having this discussion. Next question, please, Christella. All right, so lots of people are going to be impacted by this. Our question is, who's most at risk? Which of the Canadian stakeholder groups is most vulnerable? And first option is we are, that is to say the life sciences commercial companies, patients, payers, policymakers, anyone else you can think of, just put it in the chat box. Give you another 45 seconds to vote. Okay, I think we see the pattern. Yeah, I mean, these are moves that put patients last, I guess, but we'll have time to talk about that. And certainly, one out of four of us recognizes that we've got a problem. So we'll again be talking about that at some length as we go forward. So thank you for participating. Let me see. Yeah, just before we go to Professor Witek, on behalf of the National Pharma Congress, I'll very quickly acknowledge our partners at this event. They are Health Loyalty, Imprez, Inizio Engage, Cure Health, 3H Communications, the Pangea Group, Chronicle Companies. Now let's hear from Ted Witek.
Well, those of us in life sciences came out of the acute global pandemic, feeling its burden as one of the most consequential events of our personal and our vocational lifetime. And yet, as we enter the second half of the COVID decade, as I like to call it, we find ourselves perhaps with a larger public health leadership challenge with, for example, the direct effects and indirect effects of Make America Healthy Again or MAHA. And as leaders, we have to examine, not only how we got here, but what it is we can do about it when these options, for many of us seem elusive. So, optimizing our communication to minimize divisiveness, I think, is a good start. I think we've made, a few errors along the way in the past 5 years. Also, having a look at the proper allocation of resources, being honest about, suboptimal utilization of resources of funds is yet another. And then I think we also um, need to find a framework to work in. And, I was speaking with my colleague Rob Steiner, and we sort of devised, three things like, where can we pivot? Where can we find a workaround? And lastly, I mean, let's just do what works. Oh, absolutely. I think we see them distilling every day in the newspapers and in the the various journals and media that we read or listen to. And they may not be grand in and of themselves, but collectively, a lot of good can be done. And for example, one example of a workaround, that I observed relates to NIH grant funding. The overhead of grants, which is very common practice from NIH, was stripped, and others have sort of worked around to put some of those overhead expenses into the line item of grants. I think that's an interesting example of a workaround. In terms of a pivot, let's catalyze those areas of MAHA that maybe weren't our primary focus, but that makes sense. Like we all want red dye out of our Fruit Loops, right? So let's foster that, and just doing what works. Well, maybe an example of that is the using the judicial branch of government to temper the actions. One specific example of that is, early on with a lot of the cuts that were made that on contract level were illegal. The American Public Health Association, filed suits to go through the court system. So hopefully that's something that is a workaround that may be blunt, but hopefully it can work. Oh, absolutely. And there's a little bit of irony in what I often find to be the solution. it actually comes from a speech when I was a little boy. It was 1966 at the University of Cape Town, and it was delivered by Robert F. Kennedy. Yes, RFK Jr.'s father. And I have the favorite excerpt of that speech on my bulletin board here. I'm going to revert to the low art form and read it to you because it's absolutely worth it. So, few will have the greatness to bend history, but each of us can work to change a small portion of events. And then the total of all of these acts will be written the history of this generation. Each time a man stands up for an ideal, or acts to improve the lot of others, or strikes out against injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope, and crossing each other from million different centers of energy and daring, those ripples build a current which can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance. And of course, this speech became known as the Tiny Ripple of Hope speech, and in my opinion, the greatest political speech of all time. Oh, one phrase in one sentence, if you allow me. Uh, you know, less talk, more action. And what I mean, like, in public health, like all disciplines, we recall someone who exemplifies an action that resonates through time and remains with us through history. And I was thinking of the 19th century pioneering epidemiologist John Snow, who convinced the health authorities in London that the source of cholera was from the Broad Street pump. It was water. And he convinced those authorities to rip off the handle of the pump. So maybe what the sentence would be is, let's spend less time in panel discussions and more time ripping handles off pumps.
Thought-provoking stuff from Dr. Ted Witek. So we'll turn now to Eileen McMahon for her impressions of where things stand on these matters. Eileen?
Well, thanks so much, Mitch, and thank you, Professor Witek, for your remarks. Good morning, everyone. My perspective this morning is as a Canadian lawyer working with many international pharma, many of which are based with head office in the United States, but also other countries. And so from that perspective, I'd like to share with you 4 points. The first is that U.S. pharma, from my perspective, is currently focused on the United States market. So they're trying to assess right now what the changing market dynamics are. How do they respond to this? It's a huge source of revenues for them, of course. So generally speaking, Canada is an outlier in the sense of what is driving the strategy for these international pharma based in the United States, head office in the United States. I'm also seeing that, though, where head office is Europe, Japan, other countries, they're also focusing US, what are the chess moves that they're proposing to make. So why is this happening? There was an executive order that President Trump put out on May 12th of 2025. It's worth your reading it if you haven't. But that order talks about most favored nation pricing for the US market. And he doesn't mention the comparators other than to say developed nations. So others are considering this to be OECD nations. And so what does that mean? Well, the United States, as we all know, has been paying higher prices for innovative prescription drugs, and certainly higher prices as compared to Canada. So now this is where Canada does become relevant because we're a comparator. We've got a lower priced drug. What does US pharma do? If they have the drug currently on the Canadian market, do they toe the line, stay in the lane, continue with the same price? Do they lower the price? Can they lower the price if they've got patents? Do they increase the price? Can they increase the price if they have patents? Do they pull the drug from the Canadian market? These chess pieces are being assessed right now by various companies to determine what the moves might be. We all know that Canadians get already fewer percentages of drugs as compared to what's launched in the United States, 44% by an article published in 2023. So will this have an impact on patients and our choice to medicine? So that's the first point I wanted to make, the most favored nations and the executive order of May. Second point, that executive order also spoke about easing the ability of American consumers to access lower priced Canadian drugs, not mentioning Canada specifically, but they said lower priced drugs from developed nations. So what does that mean for us? Will we have leakage of products that are targeted for the Canadian market and inability of Canadians to access that? You'll likely know that there are regulations that are imposed on drug establishment license holders to prevent export of Canadian labeled drugs if it will affect Canadian supply. There are provisions in contracts that purport to limit that happening in the supply chain. But that's another point in the executive order. We'll want to keep our eye on how that develops. Third point, where there is a choice between investment in the United States versus another country such as Canada, whether it's manufacturing, fill, finish, any type of investment, the nod is going, generally speaking, to the United States at present. So that's a third point to keep our eye on. If you look at announcements in recent months for investments, there's an uptick with US and even ex-US pharma investing into the United States. And the fourth point that I'd like to make, and various of my panelists will likely touch on this, to the extent that there is manufacturing of pharmaceuticals in Canada for sale to the United States, the tariffs will impact those kinds of drugs. So for example, the generic drug industry would be impacted by these initiatives. So those are the 4 points that I would like to kick off on, and I'd like now to hear from my fellow panelists on other points. Thank you, Mitch.
Great. Well, thank you, Councillor Eileen. It's time to hear now from Dr. Mike Exton, who's joining us from south of the 49th parallel. What's your view, Mike?
Well, great. It's great to be here with my fellow Commonwealth folks. My perspective comes from working for Novartis at a global level here in the US for about 8 years or so. So I've been in those sort of decision-making bodies of where we put drugs, where we supply, where we don't, what the pricing is, etc. Currently, and living the day-to-day roller coaster of Secretary Kennedy. So it's a very interesting perspective. Look. The main topics for me are clearly most favored nation pricing, tariffs, the potential impact on generics, as Eileen said, and then China. So let me run through those relatively quickly, and we can take some more discussion in the Q&A. I think regarding most favored nation pricing, yeah, it's going to be potentially looking at a market basket of countries, of developed countries, and you know, if that were to go through, I think the pretty clear implication for Canada is CADTH and your regulatory bodies are not just going to increase prices in Canada, they're going to do what works for the Canadian healthcare system. And so the clear decision that a pharmaceutical company would make would be either, if Canada is one of the reference countries, and typically for most major pharmaceutical countries, Canada comes in about the 10th or 11th largest country in their sales portfolio. So the clear decision would be if they can't get the price that would protect the US price, then it's a pretty easy decision just to not launch in Canada. And that obviously has pretty significant implications, as you said in the poll, for patients and for yourselves and your industry. So I think that's the first thing. It is important, though, to keep in mind, you know, President Trump announces all these executive orders, but they're all being prosecuted in the courts in regards to their legality. And so, you know, I think we have to keep in mind that a lot of things in the US, actually, it may not seem it at the moment, but most things have checks and balances and have to go through Congress. And that brings me to my next point, and that is of tariffs. And you may have seen even this morning that the Supreme Court said that they're going to expedite the review of the legality of putting tariffs on countries. So you need to keep that in mind as to whether these are actually going to go through in the long term. But of course, the problem is that to some degree, the damage is already done as he announces the executive orders. What does tariffs mean for Canada? In my perspective, this has really significant implications for your generics industry. I know a number of people who work with Apotex. I'm sure there's a number of other generics companies that operate out of Canada for whom the US is a significant market for them. And tariffs on pharmaceutical products have pretty significant implications for generics companies, much more than for innovator companies, because the margins are much thinner. And so whereas a company like Novartis can potentially absorb some of the tariff in their operating margin, for generics companies, that's much more difficult. So they're disproportionately impacted by tariffs importing drugs into the US. And as Eileen mentioned, actually, my company does fill finish in Vancouver for one of our products. And obviously, if the tariffs come into effect and a company like mine isn't going to be able to manage the tariff in the operating margin, then we would probably shift that business to the US, where there's a plethora of companies that can do the exact same job, albeit at a increased cost. And the final point that I think is important is more for the sort of the Canadian biotechnology industry, because a lot of what HHS is doing with the FDA and other bodies here is really putting the US at a bit of a biotechnology disadvantage compared to China. And I think the regulations that are coming through from Secretary Kennedy is making biotech companies look further afield, out of the US, out of Canada, to China, to try and source some of their biotechnology, some of their new chemical entities, just because in China the regulatory environment is much less complicated. And so that has potential for just what US companies are looking to potential partner with or license in new chemical entities and science and technology from outside of North America. So lots of interesting developments, and look forward to your questions later on.
Thank you, Dr. Exton. Yeah, you mentioned China, and headline in the New York Times this morning means we're going to be talking about Chinese biotech later this morning. Meanwhile, we'll hopscotch from the New Jersey Meadowlands to the canyons of Bay Street, Toronto. Let's hear from Brian Bloom. Brian.
Thank you, Mitch. I'm actually in a hotel in New York, so not in Canada. But I do want to thank you for inviting me to participate today, and thank the Chronicle companies and NPC and all of the sponsors of today's event. And so far, I've really enjoyed the discussion by Professor Witek, Eileen, and Mike. It's very, very special to be on a panel with such people. So, I wanted to focus mainly on the Trump's proposed tariffs of 200%, as he's proposed them for international manufacturers to sell into the United States. But also I may touch on things like the most favored nation pricing and trends in R&D. My perspective, just as Eileen introduced, she comes from a legal perspective, and Mike as an operator of an integrated R&D and commercial biopharma. I'm an expert in healthcare investing. Bloom Burton is an investment banking firm. We speak to and keep in touch with and serve hundreds of Canadian companies of all stages and types just in healthcare. And we speak to almost every global healthcare investor who would ever invest in the Canadian marketplace or a Canadian company. So it's from that perspective that I'd like to share my views. We do a lot of solicitation of funding for R&D stage companies. I would say that the Trump tariffs don't really affect R&D companies. When R&D companies perform their R&D and do discovery and preclinical development and then clinical development and commercialization preparation, by the time they're FDA approved or Health Canada approved, they're either purchased by a global pharma or those R&D companies as they grow to the size of Mike's company. Mike, your microphone is still on, by the way. They then put their commercial pieces in place, just as a big pharma would, with an eye towards where they should be manufacturing, gathering their APIs, doing their formulation, fill finish, etc. So I don't see capital flows being impacted by the Trump tariffs for R&D companies. Commercial companies, of course, that are dependent on importation, unless the Carney administration puts counter tariffs in place to counter the Trump tariffs, which, in my opinion, only makes it more expensive to import drugs and serve the needs of the Canadian healthcare system and serve the needs of Canadian patients. I think that would be a very counterproductive, in fact, self-defeating and silly thing to do. Us adding barriers and adding costs to, bringing needed drugs into our system doesn't really impact the bottom lines of American pharmaceutical companies. It's not really anything. It's not the kind of counter that would make Trump reconsider his own 200% tariffs that he's proposed. So I think that, the Canadian, the divisions of global pharma that are Canadian sales and marketing organizations and the specialty pharmaceutical companies who do import and sell, like Searchlight and like Apotex and Cipher and these sorts of smaller companies, I don't see how they're impacted unless Carney puts his own walls up, which I think would be self-defeating. For commercial companies who do manufacture and export, those are the ones, of course, where the Trump tariffs would have a major impact. I would also like to share with our audience and everyone that, I've already seen the impact of Trump's proposed tariffs change the behavior of companies who do manufacture in Canada. I have seen our own clients and our own companies that we meet with and speak with that have made decisions about setting up manufacturing and moving their full supply chain to the United States, as opposed to having them be internationally linked or certainly to be manufacturing in Canada. So that is a direct result of Trump's announcements and his bluster. Of course, as Mike pointed out, we still have a lot of regulatory legislation and judicial review of whether any of this is even legal in the United States. But, the whole purpose of him announcing this, his art of the deal, was to start changing behavior and was to, allow for more investment by global companies into the United States. And I can tell you that it's already starting to happen. Just like he proposed threats to NATO because NATO members weren't paying enough for their own defense and were freeloading off of the United States. Just that threat has already changed the behavior of defense spending in Europe and in Canada. And, part of his goal as well is to tell the world that the United States pays not too much for pharmaceuticals, but pays appropriate value for innovative pharmaceuticals. And he wants the rest of the world, especially friendly nations like Canada and Europe, to pay fair value for innovative and important pharmaceuticals made by usually American pharmaceutical companies, but also global pharmaceutical companies. So it would be in Canada's interest overall for our system, for our patients, if we were to pay appropriate price for pharmaceuticals. Maybe then, as in defense, we wouldn't be in the crosshairs of Trump and his anger and bluster. What else can I say? Most favored nation pricing. as both Eileen and Mike had touched on. I would say that isn't, I agree with what they spoke about as to how that affects the Canadian healthcare system. But if there ever is a future world where the United States benchmarks their pharmaceutical prices and lowers them to the inappropriately low prices that Canadian and European payers and governments reimburse for, our global R&D industry is in big trouble. It's only because America pays appropriate higher value for these important medicines that we even have an R&D industry, that those profits can be recycled into label expansion, new company formation, venture formation, and risky research and development. If the United States does not pay appropriate price and does not underwrite the R&D for the entire world, our whole industry is in huge long-term trouble. That is not a Canadian issue. That is a global issue. And those are my comments. And I look forward to the Q&A session.
As do we all. I think, inappropriately low prices that may trigger a few people. All right, so we've heard legal, operational, and financial perspectives. Right now, we're going to take a very short break, let some of those points sink in. This is what we call the Innovative Spotlight segment of the webinar, where we hear from our sponsors. Please watch these few short messages. We'll be back to learn more in just a few minutes.
The following message flagrantly breaches Canadian Pharmaceutical Advertising Code. Viewer discretion is advised. Do you suffer from headaches due to poor planning? Are you losing sleep over so-so brand strategy and creative that's chronically uninspired? Try Brand Aid from 3H Communications. With its unique formula, 3H's market-driven, client-proven methodology is indicated for improving the quality and efficacy of pharmaceutical advertising initiatives. Serious side effects of 3H include razor-sharp strategy, cutting-edge creative, and superb execution that's consistently on time, on budget, and on promise. 3H is not for people with low standards of excellence. Don't use 3H if you're allergic to maximum efficiency and superior results. Warning, 3H can be habit-forming. Do away with the aches and pains of ineffective pharmaceutical advertising. For performance that doesn't miss a beat, a deadline, or a budget, reach for Brand Aid from 3H Communications and exceed beyond. 3H may induce peace of mind associated with increased brand awareness, strategic prowess, unprecedented tactics, wildly successful campaigns, mind-blowing KPIs, and objectives beyond reached. 3H is associated with exceptional brand performance and with a good night's sleep. If your brand has yet to experience any one of these, email us today at contact@3h.ca.
Impress is a proudly Canadian, industry-leading contract sales organization, delivering top quality and unmatched agility to maximize sales. We continue to evolve at an unprecedented pace, driven by our mission of exceeding partner expectations. We are excited to introduce a cutting-edge innovation designed to elevate healthcare professional engagements, empowering organizations to drive stronger connections and achieve better outcomes. Meet Cogni, your best-in-class AI-powered coach, designed to revolutionize Salesforce productivity in pharma. Born from decades of hands-on experience leading, training, and scaling pharma sales teams, backed by world-class AI technology. Cogni provides hyper-realistic, data-driven simulations tailored for real-world healthcare conversations. Sharpen your messaging, master objection handling, fine-tune HCP discussions to match adoption status and their psychological profile. Make every rep confident for any call. With powerful analytics, Cogni gives managers deep, actionable insights. From individual progress to team-wide trends, it helps you identify coaching opportunities and scale what works. Enterprise-grade security, global reach, and unmatched support from onboarding to ongoing success. Ready to revolutionize your pharma sales performance? Book your Cogni demo today.
Health Loyalty is a leading provider of patient relationship management software for the creation, implementation, and monitoring of patient support and loyalty programs. We provide an agile, vendor-neutral, cost-effective, automated, sustainable platform that simplifies everything. With innovation at our core, we have developed an adaptable and customizable patient support platform that improves patient engagement and retention. Health Loyalty is your single source of truth, giving you better control of your data, reducing costs, and providing you with a suite of on-demand marketing capabilities and real-time reporting dashboards designed to provide meaningful program insights. Health Loyalty ensures you have what you need to face the future. Are you ready? PSPs are evolving. It's now time to embrace the integration of artificial intelligence and digital into your PSPs with Health Loyalty. Learn more about the life science industry's most comprehensive patient relationship management software for the creation, implementation, and monitoring of patient support and loyalty programs. Discover the power of Health Loyalty. To book your demo, visit www.healthloyalty.com. Empower, educate, evolve.
And we are back. We were about to hear from our panel, but first we have two more poll questions to see how you delegates feel about things. So can we have our third question of the morning, please? All right, appropriately headlined elbows up question mark. How prepared are Canadian organizations, including your own, currently to respond to changes in the U.S. health ecosystem? Go ahead and vote, please. Yep, I see a trend. Okay, I think the results are in. The summary in junior high school parlance would be, we've been pantsed. So let's accept that and go on to the next question, please. All right, is there a silver lining in this? Amid all these many threats we've been hearing about, where are the greatest opportunities for Canada? And we know that there must be some. So are they a chance to reform our domestic regulatory restrictions, chance to attract new investment to Canada by way of Bloomberg, recruiting new life sciences talent to Canada? Dr. Exton, I'm sure there's something for you here. Making Canada more appealing as a pharma exporter to the rest of the world, excluding the USA. Please vote. Okay, this is interesting. Well, you can see the results. There is a silver lining. It doesn't really seem to be all that apparent what it is, but maybe we can shed some more light on this when we bring our panelists back, as we will do right now. So panelists, come on back. We have just heard from the people. The people have spoken. We'll return to our experts. But before we get to our numerous questions from the delegates, I'm going to use the moderator's prerogative to ask the first one myself, and this is for all three of our panelists. As I mentioned, this morning's New York Times, just out, contains two items about two new developments that could further shake the pharma sector. First up, the Trump administration is planning to ban direct-to-consumer drug advertising. And that was controversial when it came out more than 25 years ago, but it's been a significant business driver for pharma, but also for the troubled media sector. Apparently, Washington is considering a crackdown on physician social media influencers who accept payments from drug marketers. So that's a kind of an interesting side issue. But wait, there's more. Separately, the Times reports Trump wants to contain the innovative side of the Chinese biotech industry, which I think we all know is moving several times faster and more aggressively than their peers in the rest of the world. So, Mike, you're really at the center of all this in the Garden State. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think regarding the advertising, of course, the devil will be in the detail. I think they're particularly focused on ensuring that there's fair balance in a lot of the advertising. And as you're moving into influencers and this sort of thing, this sort of fair balance between risk and benefit gets blurred, of course. But honestly, I actually think that's good. You know, when I first came to the US, one of the very first decisions I had to make, it was the week 1 or week 2, was should we spend $150 million for the year on TV advertising? And it's become kind of like a war game, and people just, you know, I'll spend more, I'll spend more, I'll spend more, and I think the ability to remove that as part of the overall ecosystem is actually a good thing. I'm not too bothered about that. So long as everyone plays on the same playing field, I think it's good.
Yeah, thank you. Any insights from Brian or Eileen?
My only additional comment would be, I can only imagine the hurdles, right? Because you're talking about US legislation, the Food and Drugs Act and regulations. Our corresponding legislation in Canada, the regulations provide that you can't advertise prescription drugs directly to consumers. So it's a legislative change. And so I can imagine hurdles and challenges. Mike alluded to those that are already ongoing vis-a-vis the executive order.
Brian, any thoughts?
I can only add that as a consumer, I think pharmaceutical advertisements are positive as long as they're regulated to be balanced, as we talked about. But awareness by consumers as to what their choices are and what they can do for their diseases. I think in the United States, you could talk about the indication, but not the drug. And in Canada, it's the reverse or something like that. All of these regulations, in my mind, as a consumer, are really stupid, and they don't really serve anybody. So as long as there's legislation to make them balance. With respect to China, obviously, we do a lot of venture stage financing and R&D stage financing. Instead of tamping down the the Chinese R&D industry as it's starting to accelerate, what Trump really should do is focus on, unleashing as much as he can and supporting the the North American or Western biotechnology R&D industries. He could do that by, unleashing more funding for NIH, which of course is the fertilizer for the academic understanding of disease and the publication of science, which leads to biotechnology R&D and formation. And he can do that by reducing regulation for clinical activity and R&D. So,
yeah, very
and Mitch,
interesting.
could I just want to play on Brian's point, with which I agree in terms of unleashing. And we had a polling question about the impact on Canada. I do see a silver lining here in that we should be re-examining what are we good at in Canada and what could we be extraordinary at. Can't be everything, right, in the supply chain, but there'll be certain areas where I think we have deep expertise. And I would like the lens that Brian offered to President Trump. I think we ourselves as Canadians should bring that same lens to Canada. What are we good at? And let's get really good at it to compete internationally so that we've got a terrific, robust sector in certain slices.
Great.
I like that approach. I just, as a capitalist, I hate the royal we. I don't. Canada doesn't act in lockstep. We don't all link arms and work together. And if you say we, if that means a new department in the Carney administration to fix Canada so that we can all do something together. I don't like that.
Yeah,
But
I would
one
love to
thing,
see like thought leaders, right, Brian? Like
yeah,
not the
well,
government, but just, to
sure.
the extent that we're innovating in certain sectors like AI and med tech or certain
Yeah.
other areas where we're blazing the trail. What
I
can
think in all
individuals
areas
do?
of research and development, whether it be medical technology, AI influenced or not, and in biotechnology, we do excel there. And, we invent a lot of drugs, we develop a lot of drugs, we grow a lot of small companies that then get purchased or get partnered with global companies. And we shouldn't shy away from that just because we're not creating the next Pfizer or Amgen. There's nothing wrong with creating small and mid-sized companies and sometimes large global companies that contribute to the health of everyone globally.
Great. Well, Mike, I know you wanted to follow up with Brian on one of his, let's just say, more provocative comments about pricing.
No, it's just, and this gets lost in the argument, that the US drug prices are much higher than everywhere in the world. That's very clear. The list price is much higher than anywhere in the world.
Yes.
There's two uncomfortable truths that don't sort of fit the narrative when they're trying to bash drug companies, and these are those. These points are, firstly, the drug price, the list price, is not the price that the company actually earns. In actual fact, the list price is probably, or the net price that companies earn is somewhere south of 50% of the list price, because there's these things called pharmaceutical benefit managers who take rebates and all this sort of stuff. So that's the first thing. So actually, the net price oftentimes is not too dissimilar, still higher than you get internationally. The other piece is that, yes, drug prices are higher, but healthcare is higher in the US. The cost of healthcare is higher. Everything's expensive in healthcare in the US. And as a percentage of healthcare spend, pharmaceuticals are no higher in the US than they are in any other country. So the whole idea that, you select drug companies and drug prices because they're the bane of the overall healthcare spend is just not correct.
I would argue, though, that I think we have a lot of common ground. I agree with most of your points. The net prices, though, on a dollarized basis in the United States are still higher than they are in Canada. And not only on the per patient, but the amount of usage that's allowed in the United States, but mainly by private insurers, but also in the public system. There are more guardrails and rationing in Canada. And it's because instead of healthcare being a business, which has its positives and its negatives, it is seen as an entitlement in Canada, which needs to be rationed like welfare. And that doesn't serve the health of Canadians or our industry here in Canada. So no, I'm not proud of the Canadian system. There's a lot wrong with it. And Eileen's statistic to lead us off was the most striking to me. 44% of the drugs available to Americans are available to Canadians. I represent an unnamed small specialty pharma in Canada who's trying to bring cancer drugs into Canada. And this particular company competes in the multiple myeloma space. And as we're raising capital for this company, we have to tell US investors that your multiple myeloma patients have 12 options, and in Canada, they only have 4. And it's because of, lots of different reasons, pricing, small size of our market. So our patients don't benefit, and that's very sad. But the fix to all of this, what I hear a lot of in the Canadian commentary and online too, is people saying this is like Trump may be triggering a lot of this, but these are changes we should have made in the past 10 years or 20 years. Yeah, and it goes beyond just pharmaceuticals, interprovincial trade barriers, energy exploitation. All of these things are things that, yes, Trump is scaring us into and threatening us into making these changes. We should have made all of these changes a long, long time ago.
Yeah, he's accelerating it. Instead of taking 10 years, he's going to try and take a year to get all of this done. So
good.
Wow. Yeah, let's see if it happens. But I agree.
Exactly.
I think
I hate his tactics, and I hate, and I really disrespect the person. But for what comes out of his mouth, there are some truths there, and if it causes some introspection and policy change in Canada, that can be very positive.
Okay, well, what's coming out of our delegate's mouth is a couple of questions. Here's one for Dr. Exton. A delegate asks, you mentioned that although Trump's tariffs are still in legal limbo, the damage has already been done. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, I mean, clearly tariffs are already in place. So companies are hurting, decisions are being made. And so these are decisions that sometimes could be very difficult to reverse. So, one example right now is just for us personally, the fill finish for one of our drugs, as I said, takes place in Vancouver. We haven't pulled the trigger yet to potentially move that manufacturing, that final stage manufacturing to the US, but it's a consideration. And so, you sort of blow that up on a much larger scale for much larger companies, and they're making investment decisions now that even if the tariffs are reversed, those decisions to move manufacturing supply chain from different countries, they're hard to unwind once the decision has been made.
Mm-hmm. Okay, another delegate question. We'll throw this one Brian's way. How might smaller or mid-sized Canadian pharma companies be affected differently than larger players?
I don't see small and mid-size importation and distributors or commercialization companies, what we call specialty pharma companies, being impacted. Obviously, small manufacturing companies who then sell into Canada or especially export. The smaller they are, the less able they are to absorb any ultimate tariff impact.
Yeah,
and as I mentioned, I'm already starting to see those trends trickle down into investment decisions.
Yeah.
And everyone should remember that whether it's the stock market or the private equity markets, all investors are forward-looking, which means if Trump says something today and it has a potential impact 2 or 5 years from now, it impacts investment decisions yesterday. Sorry, Mike.
No, I think just to add to that, the only piece where it impacts smaller companies disproportionately is supply chain. I mean, tariff is just a part of the supply chain. It's an additional cost to your supply. And companies like Lexicon compared to a company like Novartis, all of our distribution margins are much thinner than they are for a big company. We don't have the volume that a big company has. So whether it's the warehousing, the logistics, etc., it all costs more for a smaller company than it does for a larger company. So, that you add that into the mix, and they'll feel the heat a little bit more. Not in a crazy way, but a little bit more. Just another thing to worry about.
Adding to a long list. All right, here's a question for Eileen from a delegate. Can Canada maintain domestic price controls such as those implemented by the PMPRB while complying with potential U.S. most favored nation pricing demands?
Well, very interesting question. So a little bit of history for those of you who were attentive back in the late 80s when Brian Mulroney introduced free trade, right? At the time, Canada had compulsory licensing under our Patent Act. That meant that any pharma company based in Canada could get a license from the government of Canada to make, import, export a drug for 4% of their net sales. So the negotiation back in the late 80s was the US said, we want you to trade with us, but if you do, you've got to remove compulsory licensing. So that was taken away, but Canada said, we want this PMPRB. So we do have some thought leaders now saying, with the trade agitation, should we strengthen the PMPRB and actually have a return to compulsory licensing? So that is a discussion. What am I seeing? The statistic that I quoted this morning that Brian mentioned, the 44%, that was 2023. And of course, looking back at data from a year or two prior to that, I think it would be very interesting to look at data a few years' time for now, because what I'm seeing is that we're getting fewer launches. There may be NOCs being granted, but actually whether it's launched, there's a pause or slowing of the pace. And so query how that's going to affect us. Also, big trend to keep your patents pending as opposed to issuing them. Because PMPRB does not have jurisdiction if the patent is pending. They only have jurisdiction if there's one patent pertaining to the drug that issues. So again, if we were to look at the data, I bet you would see a slowing of prosecution of Canadian patents while people try to figure out the chessboard.
Or abandoning or donating patents.
That is absolutely right. So let's look at GLP-1 and Ozempic. Novo Nordisk has no patents on the Canadian Patent Register. That's Canada's version of the Orange Book, because they wanted flexibility in pricing, I would think. But that's all public. In terms of looking up the data, that's public knowledge what the data is.
Wow. Well, we're into the home stretch now, and the questions are coming in quickly, so maybe we can get some snappy answers. Here's a question from Mike. Based on your global experience, which Canadian supply chain choke point would you prioritize for immediate risk assessment under these new U.S. tariffs? Would that be APIs, formulation, or packaging? And the questioner adds, and why?
Yeah, I think most API comes from China and India these days. So it's really the fill finish, the packaging. That's where there's quite a lot of Canadian companies that are very competitive. And so that's where I think the biggest choke point is going to be for Canada.
Interesting. Question for Brian from a delegate. How do you expect investors to respond to prolonged tariff uncertainty, and what can help retain capital in Canada?
As I mentioned, I don't see the threat of tariffs and even the implementation of tariffs affecting the vast, number of or proportion of Canadian headquartered companies and their ability to capitalize. Only those that manufacture here and export, importers and R&D stage companies, from my vantage point, have not and will not be impacted greatly.
Interesting. All right, one question. I think Ben is going to rejoin us in about 90 seconds or so. Oh, Ben. Hello,
I'm here, Mitch. I'm here. Go ahead, though.
You're standing right in front of me. Okay. Question I'll throw out for the group, and I think this will probably be the last for the morning. How should Canadian pharma firms leverage multinational relationships to secure carve-outs or relief from U.S. tariffs, just given our day-to-day familiarity with our U.S. colleagues?
Yeah, so one point, Canada is oftentimes a leading, when you think globally of all the countries that you're looking to launch and register a product, global companies will usually come to Canada because CADIF is very rigorous and gives great feedback in planning for how we launch across the world. So I think continuing to leverage the Canadian capabilities, both from a regulatory perspective, but also from a commercial implementation, there are things that Canada provides, and I think I talked about this with the Pangea group a few weeks ago. There are things that Canada as a business provides the global outlook beyond just the revenue and price. So I think taking advantage of that, the business models, the implementation, execution, these are all things that you can leverage with the global counterparts.
Okay. Well, I've got a few shout outs I'll need to make in about 90 seconds. Ben, any impressions from the morning's conversation? Any takeaways from your perspective?
Well, I think it was well said by the panel. Hurry up and wait, but no, think about the future and act yesterday.
Nicely put. Okay. So that's it. We'll continue this conversation on Tuesday, November 4th at the Mississauga Convention Center during the live 19th Annual National Pharmaceutical Congress. Ben, you'll be there.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it. We're going to have an action-packed session. And if you need information, pharmacongress.info.
That's where it is. And best of all, everyone on this call has just saved $400 on the registration fee for the live event by attending today's virtual webinar. Just use the discount code when you register. So you can keep up with these matters by listening to the NPC podcast with Jim Shea, Mark McElwain, and me. It's available wherever you get podcasts. While you're at it, subscribe for free to the NPC Health Biz Weekly e-newsletter. We're going to keep you informed whether you want it or not. Thanks to Eileen, Brian, Mike, and Ted, along with Jeff Martins, Ben and the Pangea team, as well as Alan Ryan and our Chronicle Companies family. Final shout out to our collaborators. They are the finest companies in the life sciences: Health Loyalty, Imprez, Initio Engage, Cure Health, 3H Communications. And the last word for today is elbows up. Now it's time for lunch.
Very good. Thanks,
Thank you.
Eileen, Brian,
Thank you,
Mike.
Ben. Thank you, Mitch. Thanks,
you.
Brian and Mike.
Be well.
Thank you.
Bye-bye
Bye,
now.
everybody.